Hi guys, welcome to the Headphone Show. Today we're going to talk about the ZMF Pendant. This is a transformer-based rectifier tube amplifier that's been designed in collaboration with Amps and Sound. And currently you can buy this for around $2,000 on the ZMF website, but I think it also comes bundled with a number of ZMF headphones. So if you want to get a discount, you can check out those bundles as well. All right, let's take a look. Alright, so this is the first full tube amplifier that I've had a chance to properly evaluate for any stretch of time. I've previously actually owned some of the tube hybrid amplifiers, but I've never spent time with anything quite like this before. And that's largely because I've never really been a tube kind of guy. I like the idea, but I've been more focused on the solid state end of things because I think I've been too busy chasing this idea of transparency and, focusing on measurements and seeing, how clean a signal I can possibly get. And while that's great, I think that far too frequently we spend time, latching onto data points where people are squabbling over measurements where there really is zero perceptible difference there. And I find that there's too much time spent focused on that and not enough time spent focused on what the actual experience ends up being, regardless of what these data points indicate. As much as I like measurements, I think that the data points for this kind of stuff are incomplete as far as the way that things were down to the experiences that we end up having. And if anything, listening to the Pendant and the ZMF Verite here for a certain period of time, it underscores the importance of focusing on the experience more than anything else. And to explain that difference in experience, I have to focus primarily on stage depth and textural nuances. You guys have heard these terms before, and maybe they don't mean anything to you, but the best way that I can probably describe the way that this sounds with the ZMF Verite is that lateral definition is enhanced and the furthest depth that you get is much more prominent. So you notice the depth capabilities of the headphone more. And I recognize that, when you use a tube amplifier, you're introducing imperfections to a certain degree. And that is interesting for a number of reasons. But as far as its sonic character goes, this is something that I think we need to not really worry too much about because the overall experience is that much more interesting. And I was swapping between the ZMF Pendant and the SPL Phonitor X, which is a fairly high-end solid-state amplifier. With the ZMF Verite, I actually preferred the Pendant because it adds that extra sense of depth capability for lateral definition that any of the solid-state amplifiers that I have here just aren't able to do. In fact, even the balanced output on the Cayenne IHA6 doesn't even come close to the depth that the Pendant is able to deliver. And the other key difference that I notice is textural nuance for certain frequency ranges, specifically for instruments that fall in the mid-range and lower mid-range. So for example, the textural quality of acoustic guitars, there's something a little bit more nuanced and interesting there with the Pendant versus the solid-state presentation. As I was going through my test tracks, the song that stood out to me the most as far as demonstrating the Pendant's ability in both depth, distinction, and textural nuance was the song Dogs by Pink Floyd on the Animals album. There's a section there where you have two very distinct sides for acoustic guitars, and then there's also some sounds in the middle, and the way that it's able to handle this separation and distinction and nuance for depth and all of this, it was just fantastic. And so if anybody has this amplifier, I encourage you to listen to that song to see what I'm talking about. It's fantastic, and it does it so much better than any of the solid-state amplifiers that I listen to the Verite on. For the solid-state amplifiers, you get a much more focused and direct presentation, whereas, again, with the Pendant, it's a lot more pulled apart. You get a lot more depth there. I think that's probably the case for a lot of these full-size tube amplifiers, but I also want to stress that this is not like other tube amplifiers, at least so I'm told, because I haven't had a chance to evaluate a ton of them. Remember, this is not an OTL amp. This is a transformer-based one, so it's not quite like a lot of those other things like the bottlehead stuff or the dark voice and all of that stuff's going for. This is a much more what I'm going to describe as a neutral sound. And actually, I measured this headphone with the Pendant on both the low output and the high output for the different output impedances, and then I compared that with the measurement on the SPL Phonitor X, and there was a difference with the high output. And actually, let's talk about that now, because this is supposed to be a versatile amplifier that's meant to be able to handle lots of different headphones. And I think it's It's probably true that it can power a lot of different headphones. It's versatile in that sense. But as far as what it's best suited for, I really think that that is mostly going to be ZMF headphones or high impedance dynamic driver headphones. And then I also found that with some of the Focal headphones, this also didn't do all that well. But then when I switched to the Sennheiser HD820, which it's not my favorite closeback by any means, but this really, you could tell there was a lot more going on in the HD820 than there was with some of the lower impedance headphones. So I think it's really, if you want to get the most out of your high impedance dynamic driver headphones, that's at least been my experience. You know, maybe there's other planar magnetic headphones that would do really well with something like this, but that's just been my experience so far. But the other thing that I wanted to mention with the versatility is that we have the high and low outputs here. The high output is 300 ohms and the low output is 8. And to me, that's super weird. It's weird that the idea behind this would be that it's really versatile for a wide range of headphones, because again, coming from that solid state background, you always want the lowest output impedance that you can find, because you don't want it to change the frequency response, you don't want it to add distortion. And then I had to think about that a little bit, and I had to give my head a shake, because I had to remind myself that this is a tube amplifier. And so the point is to slightly influence the sound. Right? We got to get away from this idea of transparency is the only thing that we're looking for. Transparency as far as the music is concerned is a different question. Transparency as far as peering into the music and making it realistic and lifelike, that is not the same question. So getting rid of that notion of transparency, I think, goes a long way to being able to enjoy something like this, because it'll start to make a little bit more sense with the outputs that it has. And so again, because it's a tube amplifier, I think the purpose is to change the sound a little bit, and using the high output does. But it is also going to increase the distortion a little bit. So when you actually volume match this to the same as the low output, which just means you got to turn up the volume dial a little bit on the low output. If you volume match this, the high output gives you a little bit of extra bass. It's a couple dB more as what I measured. And I think that explains why some people have said that the high output gives a better sense of slam. But I really just think that it's just because you get more bass energy there. You know, it imparts the perception of extra impact. But I found that I was happy using the Verite on the low as well. I find that the Verite already has plenty of bass, so I don't really feel the need to do that. I'm just imagining that maybe there are other headphones where you might want to do that. You might want to use the high output and then add a little bit of bass. Maybe again, the Sennheiser HD800, something like that. If you're okay with adding a little bit of the distortion that you do get there. And with that said, there are also going to be headphones where if you use the high output, you're going to end up boosting the bass way more, because remember that ZMF Verite is a 300 ohm headphone. If you have headphones with lower impedances, this is likely to change a little bit more drastically. You're thinking of the Focal Utopia, that would change a lot because there's a 50 hertz impedance spike there. So you'll boost the bass like crazy with that headphone. So I wouldn't use the high output with that one. I would use the low one. So really that question of versatility needs to be tempered with, it's versatile within reason. You wouldn't want to run anything that's super low impedance off of this, because you would impact the frequency response a little bit more substantially than I think you would want. But the bottom line for how this sounds with the Verite, and I imagine other ZMF headphones as well, is that it adds a very welcome character that I really enjoy. And I think that that's something that needs to be taken a little bit more seriously by a lot of these folks who are just looking for transparency. You need to think instead about what is the experience that you want from your music? And that's when something like this starts to make a little bit more sense. All right, so I also want to talk a little bit about the design and the tubes and all this stuff. The first thing with the design, you have these 3 blocks. It looks a little bit odd, but this is just sort of how it goes. The weirdest thing to me is that the power cable is on the top. And you have this beautiful wooden design here for everything, and you get the tubes, and it all looks nice. But then the power cable is this just massive thing that hangs out off the top, and it kind of takes away from the aesthetic a little bit, at least in my opinion. But maybe that was just a requirement for, you know, putting together this design. And I've seen other amps and sound amps, and they do look similar, so I guess that makes a certain amount of sense. And then you do also have this cable coming out of the top as well. Again, it's a little odd. The tubes in here right now are the JJ Electronics ones, but I did find that there was one from Baldwin for the 12AU. I think it's one of the vintage ones that you can get. That one sounded fantastic with this as well. That one and this one here from JJ, they were my favorites. But the reason why I really liked that one is because it was dead quiet. With all the other tubes that I tried, including these ones, there's a tiny little bit of tube noise that comes through, and you have to wait for a little bit before it'll disappear. So maybe that's just normal, but once again, that Baldwin tube that I was using, it sounded fantastic, and it also was completely silent. So in my mind, I would go with that one or this JJ one if you just want to go with all of the matching set. I just put this in here for now because I like all the matching stuff, but I did spend a lot of time playing with the different options. With that said though, I mean, swapping out the different tubes doesn't make a huge difference. The biggest difference is between the amplifier and maybe a solid state amplifier. Because remember that if you want to swap tubes, you got to power down the unit, you got to wait for a little bit, you got to plug the different tubes in, power it back on, wait for a little bit longer, and then listen again. And so it's kind of hard to identify exactly what the differences are. I think a lot of it is you'll find yourself again convincing yourself that you hear things because you're paying attention to certain things, trying to listen for certain things. And it's not going to be a very reliable test. So when something sounds different enough where it's memorable, I think that's when those differences start to matter with this kind of stuff. They say that this is around 3 watts for the low output impedance and 2.5 watts for the high output impedance, but I really did not need to increase the volume much on this, even for the low Z output. It really has tons of power, and I wonder if those numbers are accurate. I think it might actually have a little bit more than that, because it was very easy for this to drive the Verite, and that's without any preamp or anything like that. This is just straight from a DAC directly into this. So I think that while there are some people who are extremely focused on this idea of transparency, and they're trying to find the best measuring source equipment that they can find, whether it's DACs or amps, and then they're squabbling over completely imperceptible differences, it's worth keeping an open mind to something like this, because if you let go of that idea of transparency and instead try out something like this and just focus on the experience, I think you'll end up finding something new. I think you'll end up learning something, as I have, that there's more to the experience than just what those numbers on the graph show. There's more to the experience than, you know, those tiny little imperceptible differences in distortion measurements. And if you think about the experience, which is again the most important thing, it's more important than any of the data points, something like this is bound to change your mind. It's changed my mind to the point where I now need to know about this stuff. I now need to go down the tube rabbit hole and figure out what this is all about, because I've been ignoring it for too long. So overall, do I recommend the ZMF Pendant? I think if you're into ZMF headphones and maybe you own a few of them, yeah, I absolutely recommend this. This is a great pairing for ZMF headphones. I think it's a pretty good pairing for high impedance dynamic driver headphones as well. And I also want to stress that I don't know if this is the best tube amplifier for ZMF headphones. The Glen OTL is something that's also celebrated, and I think it's worth looking into as well. And there are also other amplifiers out there, even from the guys who make this, Amps and Sound, that are worth looking into to ensure that you're getting the right kind of sound. But what I can say confidently is that with the ZMF Verite, this sounds fantastic. And if you're considering buying the Verite and you're looking for a companion amplifier, this is a great place to start. All right, that does it for this video. Thanks for taking the time to watch it, and I'll see you guys in the next one.